Definitely a question that gets brought up a lot these days is, do protests matter? And it certainly gets brought up in the Chapter 7, Occupy Wall Street chapter in Zizek's The Year of Dreaming Dangerously. That was written in 2011, but here in 2019, we're still dealing with that question, do protests matter? Do marches matter? Does it make a difference if I spend an hour or a half a day or a day protesting or demonstrating somehow? The reason the question is being raised is because we see demonstrations and protests happening all over the place, and yet nothing seems to get done. A good example of that is the protests that pop off whenever there's a mass shooting, and people in the news media and elsewhere talk a lot about how something needs to happen, something needs to change. Protests happen in one form or another, followed by really nothing major happening, no major difference. The thing that Zizek looks at in this chapter is Occupy Wall Street. It went on for quite some time. It went on all over the place in various countries as it spread out into South America, Europe, Africa, Australia. But then it kind of faded eventually. And it brought this question back. Do all protests these days, no matter how prolonged or how serious, end in nothing? One of the things that was raised about Occupy Wall Street was that the people involved didn't have any sort of coherent plan, that there wasn't any even set of coherent demands. Definitely not like a plan for what would happen afterwards. Also that it seemed more like a party or a lark at times from the outside, and less of a serious protest. I'm sure that varied from place to place and time to time. And there's a large way in which these things can seem almost just like opportunities for people to vent and get out their sense of frustration. Definitely Zizek talks a lot about that in this book. There's kind of a anger, frustration that bubbles up in people. They don't even know exactly, they don't conceptualize exactly where it comes from, and yet it's coming up, and it voices itself in these movements, and then there's no or very little follow-through or reaction to them. But he doesn't actually take the criticism that there is no plan or even set of demands terribly seriously. That's a lot to ask of people, and actually, what he tries to do is give some of that, his suggestions for what people ought to do. One of the things that he talks about in this chapter reminded me of the strategy that seems to be advocated by the group Extinction Rebellion, which I've become familiar with because there's a climate strike going to happen on September 20th in various parts of the world, in Europe, in the United States, in elsewhere around the world, where people are going to walk out of their places of business, of their universities, their schools, etc. At least this is the idea. And by walking out, I guess, disrupt things enough to get attention to the problem, in this case, the climate change issue. Many people involved in aspects of this kind of protest have this same looming question. What does it matter? Am I sort of wasting my time? Am I in fact maybe even in a weird sort of way cooperating with the system by blowing off steam and helping other people blow off steam without any real effect? It's a big question. It's an important question. And the way that Extinction Rebellion seems to address this is the organization is actually asking for what Zizek would call in this chapter a civil society movement, whose aim would be to exert pressure on the existing political parties. I say that because Extinction Rebellion is calling for a sort of citizens' assembly concerned with climate change laws, regulations, an assembly that would be more or less superimposed. I could be wrong about this, but this is my understanding from looking at their website. that the Citizens Assembly would be superimposed upon the existing, in this case, English political system, and would govern on those issues and would be superior to Parliament, for instance, on those issues. They'd have to be listened to. Now, that may seem like weird, I mean, usually when people think of mass movements, they think of the overturning or toppling of regimes and replacing. The kind of cool thing about this idea of civil society movement superimposed on the existing order is that you retain some order. So when I first saw this, I thought, that's a cool idea. It's still far-fetched in a way relative to, all of these things are hard for us to imagine how they could happen until they indeed happen sometimes. Major change happens. But it sounded good, relatively speaking, because the biggest problem that we have when full-on revolutions happen is that the people who cause them to happen are oftentimes not the people who end up afterwards ruling. Or, for instance, in the case of Mao, the same people who started the revolution end up changing and therefore do not fulfill the vision and oftentimes indeed make things worse. So putting this sort of a citizens' assembly on top of the existing order and basically saying we're changing the Constitution, okay, we're retaining the order, but we're modifying it, we're amending it, as a matter of fact, right, to create this body because this issue has become, in their view, an existential threat, and therefore something like this needs to be authoritative. Well, you don't have the total chaos, the power vacuum. You have a struggle, but not the power vacuum chaos and oftentimes the usurpation that you get in a full-on destabilizing revolution. So that sounded good to me. I thought, well, that's a rather mature option. But then I found Zizek saying it was not good enough in this chapter. And Zizek says, for instance, about the Greeks when they began to debate what to do next, how to move beyond mere protest, the consensus was that what was needed was not a new party or a direct attempt to take state power, but a civil society movement whose aim would be to exert pressure on the existing political parties. This is clearly inadequate to the task of reorganizing the entirety of social life. To do that, one needs a strong body able to reach quick decisions and realize them with whatever force may be necessary. And Zizek ends up questioning democracy itself in a similar move to the way Marx and Engels questioned democracy. Not that democracy as an idea isn't a good one, but that democracy as it has come to exist is extremely manipulable, co-optable, in fact, not really very democratic. And so there's a deep suspicion on the part of claims of democracy in this general school of thought. And in a nutshell, the reason why he's skeptical of democracy, same reason Marx was skeptical of democracy as far as I can tell, and that is that it only goes so far in the liberal context. So you can have democratic procedure, for instance, everybody voting, certain guarantee of procedural equality. But what you can't have is democratic control of things that definitely are of interest to everyone, like, for instance, electricity, all forms of fuel, food supply, banking, things like that. And so somebody like him is going to say, well, anything short of that is not terribly democratic, but provides this, as he puts it, democratic illusion. He says that's the acceptance of democratic procedures as the sole framework for any possible change. So, the idea that we can make change through democratic procedures, and also that democracy only should go so far, that it should only be procedural and should not more or less suffuse itself into these areas of our lives and our economy. Should not be allowed in that sphere that we have come to think of as private or corporate control. I don't know, which way is better, but I do know that that's a major distinction that's worth contemplating for anybody who's thinking of joining a movement or joining a protest to try to obtain change. Do you glom onto the system, sort of superimpose on the system a new institution, or do you radically change the system, because with the argument would be until you do, no real change can occur, that the first option is not thoroughgoing enough to ultimately matter. By the way, towards the end of the chapter, Zizek says something that reminded me very much of the Brexit situation now. He says, hence one should bear in mind the circular paradox that sustains the free vote in our democratic societies. One is free to choose on condition that one makes the right choice, which is why, when the wrong choice is made, as in, he says, when Ireland rejected the EU constitution or the Greek prime minister proposed a referendum, it is treated as a mistake, and the establishment immediately imposes a repetition of the vote in order to give the country a chance to correct its errors and make the right choice. One can see the system pushing back against the choice arguably of the democratic choice of the British people. So it's interesting. It's taking a long time. Again, that's basically the Marxist critique of democracy, is it only goes so far. It's a useful device for people to express themselves within the parameters of what's allowed within the economic system as it is. But I guess what I've been dwelling on lately is whether those two options are even the right ones to consider. That is, protest or, some sort of revolutionary change to obtain what you want on climate change or immigration or international governance. I guess I'm going to suggest a kind of strange thought, which is that maybe a lot of these protests don't work because the people involved are alienated from each other. That the people involved, in a way, haven't formed any sort of friendship, any sort of real community. They don't know each other. They're not comrades. They're individuals who have all been disturbed by the same general set of things. But until people can, really, in my thought, really do the radical subversive thing and actually start getting to know each other again, bonding with each other, becoming brothers and sisters in some sort of struggle, whatever the struggle is. I tend to think the struggle is for being human, for living a human life. Well, it seems to me that until people can do that for themselves, if they can reach beyond the things that have been set up to divide us and to keep us from really making contact with our fellow human beings, we can't really make much progress. We're going to be like the Pepsi ad with Kendall Jenner. It expresses something deeply wrong with our society, which is that when we protest, a great deal of what we're doing is expressing ourselves as individuals and partaking in an experience for ourselves. But in that whole crowd of people who look so good in that Pepsi ad, and if you haven't seen it, I can't believe you haven't, but look for it. That whole crowd of people, they're all there for themselves. So I would just suggest that a first step for anybody who wants to make radical change happen for something that they care about, the first step would be getting past themselves and looking around and making real human contact and bonds with other people. It's really hard to do now. So I will leave you with that for now, except for I would say that I have a blog in addition to this YouTube channel. I will put the address in the notes below, but it's Political Philosophy Video Blog, politicalphilosophy.video.blog. And for the most part, I post my videos and audio versions. I have a podcast that covers the same stuff, but I have started to write short essays, and I have one up there called Thrasymachus Blushing. And I'm going to try to, I'm going to write essays when I feel like it, frankly, so I'm not going to try to abide by any sort of schedule. I'll probably do audio versions of them, so you can always wait for that. But if you don't mind reading a short essay, it's up there now. All right, we'll see you next time. Bye.